Hello and welcome to the Sleepy Explanation. I'm so glad you're here. If you're settling into bed, curling up on the couch, or just trying to wind down after a long day of being a human, you've come to the right place. This is a quiet little corner of the internet where life gets soft-spoken and curiosity puts on pyjamas. Tonight, we're exploring medieval Europe, life versus medieval Asia life, a shocking comparison. And hey, if you enjoy these slow science journeys and you'd like to help this sleepy little channel grow, I'd be ever so grateful if you tapped the like button, subscribed, or even just left a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is in your corner of the night. Alright, take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. Let's begin. Picture this. It's the year 1200. You wake up one morning and discover you can time travel, but there's a catch. You can only visit the medieval world. You have two choices. Spend your day in medieval Europe or medieval Asia. Now, if you're like most people, you might think these two experiences would be pretty similar. After all, we're talking about the same time period, right? Both are medieval, both are pre-industrial, both are, well, old. But here's where things get interesting, and why you might want to pull those blankets up a little closer tonight. The differences between medieval Europe and medieval Asia weren't just different. They were so dramatically different that if you showed someone from medieval Paris what daily life looked like in medieval Kyoto, they might think you were showing them some kind of magical fairy tale. We're talking about a time roughly between 1000 and 1400 CE, what historians call the High Middle Ages in Europe. But while Europe was struggling through what we sometimes call the Dark Ages, and trust me, we'll talk about why that name exists, many parts of Asia were experiencing golden ages of art, science, technology and culture that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The word medieval comes from Latin, meaning Middle Ages, the time between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. But here's the thing that's going to keep us cosy and curious tonight. That definition only really makes sense if you're looking at European history. In China, this was the time of the magnificent Song dynasty. In Japan, the elegant Heian period was giving way to the age of the samurai. In India, incredible temple cities were being built while mathematical and astronomical discoveries were revolutionizing how humans understood the universe. So tonight, we're going to take a gentle journey through these two worlds, and I promise you, some of what we discover is going to completely flip your understanding of what life was like 1,000 years ago. We'll explore everything from what people ate for breakfast to how they stayed clean, to what their cities looked like, and trust me, the contrasts are sometimes so stark they're almost unbelievable. Let's start with something that might make you appreciate your morning shower a little more: hygiene. Now, we've all heard the stories about medieval Europe. People throwing waste out of windows, never bathing, teeth falling out left and right. And while some of these stories are exaggerated, there's unfortunately quite a bit of truth to the idea that cleanliness wasn't exactly a priority in medieval European daily life. The typical European peasant, and remember, about 90% of the population were peasants, might have bathed a few times a year, if they were lucky. The church had some complicated feelings about bathing, sometimes associating it with vanity or even sin. Public bathhouses existed in some places, but they were often shut down due to moral concerns or disease outbreaks. Most people just didn't wash very much. They changed their linen undergarments when they could afford to, and that was supposed to absorb the sweat and oils. Think of it as medieval deodorant, except not very effective. Water itself was often unsafe to drink in European cities, so people drank ale or wine instead. Yes, even children drank weak beer for breakfast, because it was safer than water. The streets in most European towns were unpaved and often functioned as open sewers. Imagine trying to sleep at night with those aromas wafting through your window. Now, let's float over to medieval Asia for a moment, and prepare to have your mind gently blown. In medieval Japan, bathing wasn't just common, it was practically a spiritual practice. The Japanese had been perfecting the art of the hot bath for centuries. Natural hot springs called onsen were considered sacred places of healing and purification. But beyond that, regular bathing was just a normal part of daily life. Japanese homes often had their own bathing areas, and the concept of being clean before entering shared spaces was deeply ingrained in the culture. The Japanese had figured out something that wouldn't become common in Europe for several more centuries, that being clean actually felt better and was probably healthier too. They had developed sophisticated soaps made from plant oils and ash, and they had turned the simple act of bathing into a meditative, almost ceremonial experience. In China during the Song dynasty, things were similarly impressive. Chinese cities had public bathhouses that were architectural marvels, multi-storey buildings with different pools for different temperatures, massage services, and even libraries where you could read while you soaked. The Chinese had invented a type of soap made from soybeans and had developed intricate plumbing systems to bring clean water into cities and take wastewater out. Medieval Chinese people understood the connection between cleanliness and health in ways that Europeans wouldn't grasp for centuries. They had toothbrushes made from bamboo and pig bristles, toothpaste made from various herbs and minerals, and they regularly cleaned their teeth. Meanwhile, in Europe, tooth care was, well, let's just say that a smile full of teeth was often a sign of youth, because most adults had lost quite a few by middle age. In medieval India, the concept of cleanliness was woven into religious and daily practice. Ritual bathing was common, and many Indian cities had elaborate systems of tanks and wells to provide clean water. The practice of oil massage and bathing was so refined that it influenced medical practices. They understood that cleanliness wasn't just about smelling better, but about preventing disease. Now, I don't want to paint medieval Europe as completely hopeless. There were exceptions, and cleanliness standards varied widely depending on where you were and what social class you belonged to. Some European nobles did bathe regularly and had access to imported soaps and perfumes, but the general cultural attitude toward cleanliness was simply different, and not in a good way. The contrast is so stark that if you took a medieval European peasant and plopped them down in a medieval Japanese village, they would probably seem shockingly, almost offensively dirty to the locals. And if you took a medieval Japanese person and brought them to a European town, they might think they'd accidentally stumbled into some kind of punishment realm. Speaking of being shocked by different environments, let's talk about cities, because the urban landscapes of medieval Europe versus medieval Asia were about as different as, well, as a muddy village path versus a marble palace courtyard. Medieval European cities were, to put it gently, a bit of a mess. Most were small. We're talking about populations of maybe a few thousand people at most. London, one of the larger European cities, had perhaps 80,000 people by 1300. The streets were narrow, winding, and usually unpaved. Buildings were cramped together, built mostly of wood and thatch, which meant fires were a constant terror. There was no city planning in the way we'd recognise it today. Cities just kind of grew organically, like mushrooms after rain, with little thought to organisation or efficiency. Waste management was, shall we say, primitive. People dumped their garbage and human waste into the streets or into nearby rivers. The same rivers they got their drinking water from. Yes, you're starting to see some connections to that hygiene problem we just discussed. Most European cities didn't have street lighting, so after dark the urban landscape became genuinely dangerous. There were no police forces as we'd recognise them. If you needed to get around at night, you'd better bring your own torch and probably some friends with weapons. Now, let's take a dreamy journey over to medieval Asia, where the urban experience was so sophisticated it would make a modern city planner weep with envy. Kaifeng, the capital of Song dynasty China, had over 1 million residents by the year 1100. 1 million. That made it larger than any European city would be for centuries. But size wasn't even the most impressive part. It was how well organised everything was. Chinese cities had paved roads, street lighting with oil lamps, and organised waste collection. They had fire departments with watchtowers and coordinated emergency response systems. The streets were laid out in organised grids, with wide boulevards for major thoroughfares and narrower streets for residential areas. They had public parks, public libraries, and even public clocks so people could coordinate their activities. The commercial districts were marvels of organisation. Different crafts and trades were grouped into specific neighbourhoods, so you knew exactly where to go for silk, or tea, or books, or metalwork. These weren't just random shops scattered about. We're talking about sophisticated commercial zones with quality standards and business regulations. Medieval Chinese cities had something that wouldn't appear in European cities for centuries. Restaurants. Not just taverns where you might get some bread and ale, but actual restaurants with menus, professional chefs, and regional cuisines. Some Chinese cities had thousands of restaurants, serving everything from simple noodle dishes to elaborate banquets. In Japan, cities like Kyoto were masterpieces of aesthetic urban planning. The streets were clean, the buildings were elegantly designed, and there was a harmony between architecture and nature that made the entire urban experience feel almost like walking through a garden. Japanese cities had public fountains, organised markets, and a level of civic pride that showed in every carefully maintained detail. Medieval Indian cities were equally impressive in their own ways. Cities like Chidambaram or Thanjavur were built around magnificent temple complexes that weren't just religious centres, but entire urban ecosystems. These temple cities had libraries, schools, hospitals and workshops, all integrated into a single, beautifully planned space. The architecture was so sophisticated that these buildings have survived for 1,000 years and still take your breath away today. The contrast in urban nightlife is particularly striking. While European cities basically shut down after dark due to safety concerns, many Asian cities had thriving night markets, evening entertainment, and cultural activities that continued well into the night. Chinese cities had night markets with food vendors, storytellers, musicians, and performers. People could safely walk the streets, socialise, and enjoy their city after the sun went down. If you were a time traveller choosing between spending a week in medieval Paris versus medieval Hangzhou, the quality of life difference would be so dramatic you might think you'd accidentally jumped forward several centuries when you arrived in China. The Asian cities had infrastructure, organisation, entertainment and civic amenities that European cities wouldn't develop for another 300-400 years. Now that we've wandered through these remarkably different urban landscapes, let's settle in and talk about something that's always close to our hearts and our stomachs: food. Because the medieval dining experience in Europe versus Asia wasn't just different in terms of flavours, it was different in terms of nutrition, variety, social customs, and even basic survival. Medieval European cuisine was, how should I put this gently, limited. The vast majority of people were peasants living in rural areas, and their diet was built around a few staple grains, mainly wheat if they were lucky, barley or oats if they weren't, and rye in some regions. Bread was the foundation of every meal, making up sometimes 70% of a person's daily calories. The typical European peasant might eat the same basic meal every day for months: a chunk of dark bread, perhaps some weak ale or watered-down wine, maybe a bit of cheese if they were fortunate. Vegetables were available seasonally, and some onions, cabbage, peas in summer. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions or for the wealthy. Most peasants might taste meat a few times a year, usually pork during the winter slaughter, or perhaps some chicken. Spices were so expensive they were literally used as currency in some places. Black pepper was worth more than its weight in silver. Most European food was boiled or roasted with maybe some salt if you were lucky, a bit of parsley or sage if you had access to an herb garden. The flavour profile of medieval European cuisine can be summed up in one word: bland. Famine was a constant threat. Poor harvests meant people literally starved to death. The margin between survival and death was often just one failed crop season. Food preservation was primitive, some salting, some smoking, but mostly people just had to eat what was fresh and available in each season. Now, let's float our taste buds over to medieval Asia, where the culinary landscape was so rich and diverse it would make a modern foodie weep with joy. In medieval China, cuisine had already developed into a sophisticated art form. The Chinese had rice as their staple grain in the south and wheat-based noodles in the north, but that was just the beginning. They had developed dozens of cooking techniques: stir-frying, steaming, braising, deep-frying, each designed to bring out specific flavours and textures. Chinese cooks had access to an incredible variety of ingredients. Soy sauce had been perfected centuries earlier, providing a rich, complex flavour base. They had dozens of varieties of vegetables, multiple types of mushrooms, various beans and legumes, and a wide range of meats and fish. But perhaps most importantly, they had mastered the art of combining flavours in ways that created balanced, nutritious, and delicious meals. Spices weren't rare luxury items in medieval Asia, they were everyday ingredients. Ginger, garlic, star anise, Sichuan peppercorns, and dozens of other seasonings were commonly used. Asian cuisines had developed the concept of balancing flavours: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, creating complex taste experiences that made each meal interesting and satisfying. In medieval Japan, the cuisine had evolved into something almost philosophical. The Japanese had developed the concept of seasonal eating, adjusting your diet to harmonise with the natural rhythms of the year. Spring brought fresh vegetables and young fish. Summer offered variety and abundance. Autumn provided hearty preparations for winter, and winter meals were designed to warm and nourish the body. Japanese cooks had mastered the art of preserving food in ways that actually improved the flavour. Fermented soy products, pickled vegetables, aged rice wines. They had turned food preservation from a desperate necessity into a culinary art form. Medieval Indian cuisine was perhaps the most complex of all. The subcontinent had access to an incredible variety of spices, many of which grew nowhere else in the world. Turmeric, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, fenugreek, coriander. The list goes on and on. But Indian cooks didn't just throw spices together randomly. They had developed sophisticated understanding of how different spices worked together, how to build layers of flavour, and how to create dishes that were both delicious and medically beneficial. Ayurvedic principles meant that food wasn't just about taste, it was about balance, health, and well-being. Different foods were understood to have different effects on the body and mind. Meals were planned not just for flavour, but for their holistic impact on the person eating them. The social aspects of dining were completely different too. While European peasants often ate alone or in small family groups, Asian cultures had developed elaborate social dining customs. Chinese banquets could last for hours and included multiple courses designed to tell a story or celebrate specific occasions. Japanese tea ceremonies turned the simple act of drinking tea into a meditative art form. Indian feast traditions brought entire communities together around food that was prepared and shared as an expression of cultural and spiritual values. If you were a medieval European peasant who somehow found yourself at a Chinese banquet or an Indian feast, you would probably think you had died and gone to heaven. The variety, the flavours, the abundance and the sophistication would be completely beyond anything in your experience. And if you were a medieval Chinese or Indian diner who found yourself eating peasant food in medieval Europe, you might wonder if you were being punished for some terrible crime. With our bellies full of imaginary medieval feasts, let's wander into the realm of the mind. Because when it comes to knowledge, learning, and intellectual life, the contrast between medieval Europe and Asia become even more striking, and might completely change how you think about this period in history. We often hear about medieval Europe referred to as the Dark Ages, and while that term is somewhat controversial among historians today, there are some reasons why it stuck around. Much of the classical learning from ancient Greece and Rome had been lost or forgotten. Books were incredibly rare and expensive. Most were hand-copied by monks in monasteries, and a single book might take months to produce. As a result, very few people could read. Literacy rates in medieval Europe were astonishingly low. Even among the nobility, many couldn't read or write. Kings and queens sometimes couldn't sign their own names. For peasants, literacy was essentially non-existent. Maybe one person in 100 could read simple words, and far fewer could write. Knowledge was passed down orally, which meant that when someone died, their accumulated wisdom often died with them. Schools were rare and usually connected to monasteries or cathedrals. Education was primarily focused on religious instruction, and was available almost exclusively to boys who were training to become priests. The idea of general education, teaching people to read, write, and think critically about the world around them, simply didn't exist for most of the population. Libraries were tiny by our standards. A monastery might consider itself blessed to have a few hundred books. The greatest libraries in medieval Europe might have had 1,000 volumes, and these were considered vast repositories of knowledge. Scientific inquiry was limited and often suppressed when it conflicted with religious doctrine. The church controlled most intellectual activity, and questioning established beliefs could be dangerous. Experimentation and investigation of the natural world were often viewed with suspicion. Now, let's journey to medieval Asia, where the intellectual landscape was so vibrant and sophisticated, it would make a modern university jealous. In China during the Song dynasty, literacy rates were remarkably high, especially in urban areas. Some historians estimate that perhaps 30% of adult men in Chinese cities could read and write, a number that Europe wouldn't reach for several centuries. But even more impressive was what they were reading and writing about. Chinese scholars had developed printing technology hundreds of years before it appeared in Europe. Books weren't rare, precious objects. They were mass-produced and relatively affordable. This meant that knowledge could spread quickly and widely. Chinese libraries contained hundreds of thousands of books covering every subject imaginable. The Chinese had developed a sophisticated educational system with standardized examinations for government positions. This created a culture that valued learning and intellectual achievement. Scholars were among the most respected members of society, and education was seen as the path to success and social mobility. Chinese intellectual achievements during this period were staggering. They had advanced mathematics, including algebra and geometry concepts that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. They had detailed astronomical observations and had calculated the length of the solar year to remarkable accuracy. They had maps, compasses, mechanical clocks, and had even experimented with early forms of mechanical printing. In medieval Japan, literacy was also much more widespread than in Europe, particularly among the upper classes. But what's really remarkable is that much of Japanese literature during this period was written by women. The world's first novel, The Tale of Genji, was written by a Japanese court lady named Murasaki Shikibu around the year 1000. Women in medieval Japan were not only allowed to read and write, they were producing some of the finest literature in human history. Japanese Buddhist monasteries were centres of learning that preserved and expanded knowledge in ways similar to European monasteries, but with much broader intellectual freedom. Japanese scholars studied Chinese classics, developed their own philosophical systems, and created art and literature that revealed sophisticated understanding of psychology, nature, and human relationships. Medieval India was perhaps the most intellectually advanced region of all. Indian mathematicians had developed the concept of zero and the decimal system that we still use today. They had advanced algebra, trigonometry, and geometric concepts. Indian astronomers had calculated the circumference of the Earth and had developed models of planetary motion that were remarkably accurate. Indian universities like Nalanda were among the largest in the world, with thousands of students studying everything from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and philosophy. These institutions had libraries containing hundreds of thousands of texts, and scholars came from across Asia to study there. The contrast in intellectual freedom is particularly striking. While European scholars had to be careful not to challenge church doctrine, Asian scholars were generally free to investigate, experiment, and theorize about the natural world. This led to rapid advances in science, technology, mathematics, and medicine. If you were a curious person living in medieval times, your opportunities to learn, grow, and contribute to human knowledge would be dramatically different depending on whether you found yourself in Europe or Asia. In Europe, you might spend your entire life knowing only what your parents taught you. In Asia, you might have access to books, schools, libraries, and intellectual communities that would allow you to expand your understanding of the world in ways that most Europeans couldn't even imagine. As we settle deeper into our exploration of these two medieval worlds, let's turn our attention to something that often reveals the deepest truths about any society: how it treats its women. Because when we compare the lives of women in medieval Europe versus medieval Asia, we discover some of the most surprising contrasts yet. Medieval European women lived under what historians call a patriarchal system, but that's putting it mildly. For most women, life was a series of legal and social restrictions that would seem shocking by modern standards. A woman was essentially considered the property of first her father, then her husband. She couldn't own land in her own name, couldn't enter into contracts, couldn't inherit property except under very limited circumstances, and couldn't leave her house without permission. The Catholic Church taught that women were inherently sinful. After all, hadn't Eve tempted Adam with the forbidden fruit? Women were seen as morally weak, intellectually inferior, and in need of constant male supervision. Education for women was almost non-existent. Even noble women were usually taught only enough reading to recite prayers and perhaps manage household accounts. Marriage was rarely about love or personal choice. For peasant women, marriage was an economic arrangement between families. For noble women, marriage was a political tool to forge alliances and transfer property. A woman typically had no say in whom she married, when she married, or how many children she would have. Childbirth was dangerous and often deadly. With no understanding of sanitation or medical care, perhaps 1 in 10 women died in childbirth. Those who survived could expect to spend most of their adult lives either pregnant or nursing. Large families were necessary because child mortality rates were so high. Women couldn't enter most professions. They couldn't become scholars, couldn't hold political office, couldn't own businesses except in very rare circumstances. Even the work they could do, textile production, food preparation, childcare, was typically considered less valuable than men's work. Now let's travel to medieval Asia, where women's experiences varied significantly by culture, but were often dramatically better than their European counterparts. In medieval China, while women still faced significant restrictions, they had some rights and opportunities that European women couldn't dream of. Chinese women could own property, inherit land, and run businesses. Some became successful merchants or entrepreneurs. Education for women was more common, especially in wealthy families, and some women became accomplished poets, artists, and scholars. Chinese culture recognized different models of female virtue than just submission and silence. Women could gain respect and influence through their skills, intelligence, and contributions to their families and communities. While political power was still primarily male, women could exercise significant influence within their households and social circles. But it's medieval Japan where we find some of the most surprising contrasts. During the Heian period, aristocratic women in Japan enjoyed freedoms that would have seemed impossible in medieval Europe. Japanese court ladies were not only allowed to be educated, they were expected to be accomplished in literature, poetry, music, and art. Remember that novel I mentioned earlier, The Tale of Genji? It wasn't unusual for a woman to write something so sophisticated. Japanese court culture valued women's intellectual and artistic contributions. Women could own property, could initiate divorce under certain circumstances, and held important positions in the imperial court. Japanese Buddhism offered women spiritual paths that Christianity in medieval Europe typically denied them. Women could become nuns, could study Buddhist philosophy, and could achieve respected positions within religious communities. Some Japanese women became renowned Buddhist teachers and scholars. In medieval India, women's experiences varied greatly depending on region, religion, and social class. But many Indian cultures recognized women's spiritual and intellectual capabilities in ways that medieval Europe did not. Hindu tradition included goddesses who represented wisdom, strength, and divine power. This theological foundation created space for women to be seen as spiritually significant. Some Indian women became renowned scholars, particularly in religious and philosophical studies. The tradition of women saints and mystics was strong in medieval India, and these women often achieved significant social influence through their spiritual accomplishments. Indian mathematics and astronomy, which were among the most advanced in the world, included contributions from women scholars. While these women were rare and typically came from elite families, the fact that they existed at all shows a cultural attitude toward women's intellectual capabilities that was absent in medieval Europe. The contrast in property rights is particularly striking. While European women typically couldn't own significant property, many Asian cultures allowed women to inherit land, own businesses, and control their own economic destinies to degrees that European women wouldn't achieve for centuries. Even in areas where Asian women faced restrictions, those restrictions often came with corresponding protections and respected roles within society. The European model of seeing women as inherently inferior and dangerous was not universal in medieval Asia. Many Asian cultures recognized women's contributions as essential and valuable, even when those contributions were limited to specific spheres. If you were a woman choosing where to be born in the medieval world, your opportunities for education, property ownership, spiritual development, and social influence would vary dramatically depending on whether you found yourself in Europe or Asia. While no medieval society offered women the freedoms we consider normal today, the differences were often dramatic enough that a European woman transported to medieval Japan or China might feel like she had entered a completely different world, one where her gender didn't automatically make her a second-class citizen. Speaking of different worlds, let's drift into the realm of health and healing, where the contrast between medieval Europe and Asia become not just interesting, but quite literally matters of life and death. Because when you got sick in the medieval world, your chances of survival could depend dramatically on which continent you happened to be on. Medieval European medicine was, to put it as gently as possible, not particularly helpful. Medical knowledge was a mixture of ancient Roman ideas, Christian theology, and folk remedies, much of which was either useless or actively harmful. The dominant medical theory in medieval Europe was based on the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humours, and the most common treatment was bloodletting. Yes, if you were sick, the standard medical advice was to cut you open and drain out some of your blood, because clearly what sick people need is to lose more of their vital fluids. European doctors used leeches, performed bloodletting with knives, and prescribed treatments that often made patients worse rather than better. They had little understanding of anatomy. Dissection of human bodies was forbidden by the church for most of this period, so doctors often had to guess about how the human body actually worked. Surgery was crude and dangerous. There was no understanding of antiseptics or anaesthesia, so surgical procedures were performed on conscious patients with unsterilised instruments. Most people who underwent surgery died from infection, rather than from whatever condition originally required treatment. Dental care was practically non-existent. Tooth problems were treated by pulling out the offending tooth with pliers, often performed by barbers rather than medical professionals. Pain management consisted of getting the patient drunk and hoping for the best. Mental illness was viewed as either divine punishment or demonic possession. Treatment might involve prayer, exorcism, or being locked away from society. The idea that mental conditions might have medical causes and medical treatments simply didn't exist. Now let's float over to medieval Asia, where medical practices had developed into sophisticated systems that wouldn't seem entirely foreign in a modern hospital. Chinese medicine had developed theories about how the human body worked, that, while different from modern understanding, were internally consistent and often surprisingly effective. Chinese doctors understood that the body was a complex system where different parts influenced each other. They had developed acupuncture, herbal medicine, and diagnostic techniques that could identify illnesses in their early stages. Chinese physicians had detailed knowledge of human anatomy, gained through centuries of careful observation, and yes, dissection. They had anatomical charts, understood circulation, and had developed surgical techniques that were far more advanced than anything available in Europe. Chinese herbal medicine was incredibly sophisticated, with thousands of different plant, mineral, and animal-based remedies. Chinese doctors didn't just randomly prescribe herbs. They had developed systematic understanding of how different substances interacted with the body, how to combine them for maximum effect, and how to adjust treatments based on individual patients' conditions. Perhaps most importantly, Chinese medicine emphasized prevention rather than just treatment. Chinese doctors advised patients about diet, exercise, lifestyle, and environmental factors that could maintain health and prevent disease. This holistic approach meant that many Chinese people stayed healthier, longer, and required less dramatic medical intervention. In medieval India, Ayurvedic medicine had been refined over centuries into a comprehensive system of healthcare that addressed physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. Indian physicians understood the importance of sanitation, proper diet, and mental health in maintaining physical wellness. Indian doctors performed sophisticated surgical procedures, including cataract surgery, setting broken bones, and even early forms of plastic surgery. They had developed anesthetics made from plant compounds, antiseptic techniques using various herbs and substances, and post-surgical care that dramatically improved patients' chances of survival. Indian medical texts from this period describe hundreds of diseases, their symptoms, and their treatments. Indian physicians had developed diagnostic techniques that allowed them to identify illnesses accurately and prescribe specific treatments tailored to individual patients. Japanese medicine combined Chinese techniques with their own innovations, creating medical practices that emphasized gentleness and harmony with natural processes. Japanese doctors had developed particularly sophisticated approaches to treating mental and emotional disorders, recognizing the connection between psychological well-being and physical health. The contrast in medical training is particularly striking. While European doctors might have learned their trade as apprentices to other poorly trained practitioners, Asian medical systems had developed formal schools, standardized curricula, and rigorous training programs that could take decades to complete. Asian medical practitioners were required to study not just treatments, but anatomy, pharmacology, psychology, and even philosophy. They were expected to understand their patients as whole human beings, not just collections of symptoms. If you fell seriously ill in medieval times, your chances of recovery were dramatically different depending on where you lived. In Europe, you might be bled with leeches and told to pray for divine intervention. In Asia, you might receive sophisticated herbal treatments, surgical procedures performed with sterilized instruments, and follow-up care designed to restore your complete health and prevent future illness. The difference wasn't just in individual treatments, it was in entire approaches to what health meant and how healing should work. Asian medical systems had developed understanding that European medicine wouldn't achieve for several more centuries. Now, let's wander into the bustling marketplaces and counting houses of the medieval world, because when it comes to money, trade, and economic sophistication, the differences between medieval Europe and Asia are so dramatic they might make your head spin. Medieval European economy was, to put it simply, pretty basic. Most people lived in what historians call a subsistence economy. They grew or made just enough to survive, with little left over for trade or commerce. The majority of transactions were conducted through barter systems or feudal obligations rather than actual money. Coins existed, but they were relatively rare and often unreliable. Different regions had different currencies, and the metal content of coins varied widely, making trade complicated and risky. Many peasants might go their entire lives without handling actual money. They paid their taxes and rents in goods or labour rather than currency. European trade was mostly local. A typical peasant might trade with people in nearby villages, but long-distance commerce was limited and dangerous. Roads were poor, bandits were common, and there were no reliable systems for protecting merchants or guaranteeing contracts across long distances. Banking, as we understand it, barely existed. The Catholic Church forbade charging interest on loans, which made it difficult to develop sophisticated financial systems. What little long-distance trade occurred was usually conducted by Italian city-states or by Jewish merchants who operated outside Christian restrictions on money lending. European cities were small and had limited commercial infrastructure. Markets were typically held once or twice a week in town squares, with merchants setting up temporary stalls. There were few permanent shops and even fewer businesses that operated on a large scale. Now, let's drift over to medieval Asia, where the economic landscape was so advanced it would make a modern economist impressed. China during the Song dynasty had developed what was arguably the world's first modern economy. They had standardized currency that was accepted across the entire empire, and we're talking about an empire with tens of millions of people. But even more impressively, they had invented paper money, which allowed for much more sophisticated financial transactions. Chinese banks could issue letters of credit that merchants could use across thousands of miles. A merchant in northern China could deposit money and receive a paper certificate that could be redeemed for cash in southern China. This system allowed for large-scale, long-distance trade that was simply impossible in Europe at the time. Chinese cities had permanent commercial districts with shops, warehouses, and business offices that operated year-round. Some Chinese cities had thousands of shops selling everything from everyday necessities to luxury goods from across Asia. The scale of commerce was enormous. Some individual Chinese merchants controlled more wealth and trade than entire European kingdoms. Chinese accounting systems were sophisticated enough to track complex business operations across multiple cities and provinces. They had developed business partnerships, joint stock ventures, and even early forms of insurance for long-distance trade. The Chinese had also developed manufacturing on a scale that wouldn't be seen in Europe for centuries. Chinese workshops produced silk, porcelain, metalwork, and other goods not just for local consumption, but for export across Asia and even to Europe and Africa. Japanese commerce was similarly advanced, with sophisticated guild systems that controlled quality and training in various crafts. Japanese merchants had developed trade networks that connected Japan with China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Japanese currency was stable and trusted, and Japanese craftsmen produced goods that were prized across Asia for their quality and beauty. Indian Ocean trade networks connected medieval Indian merchants with partners from Southeast Asia to East Africa. Indian merchants operated with letters of credit, partnership agreements, and commercial practices that allowed them to conduct business across thousands of miles and multiple cultures. Indian textiles, spices, and manufactured goods were in demand across the known world. The sophistication of Asian commercial law is particularly impressive. Chinese, Japanese, and Indian legal systems had developed detailed commercial codes that protected merchants, enforced contracts, and provided mechanisms for resolving business disputes. These legal frameworks made large-scale commerce possible by creating trust between parties who might never meet in person. Asian cities had developed commercial infrastructure that European cities wouldn't achieve for centuries. Warehouses, docks, commercial banks, insurance companies, and trade associations provided services that made business operations efficient and reliable. The contrast in economic mobility is striking too. While European peasants were typically bound to the land and had little opportunity to improve their economic situation, Asian societies offered more pathways for ambitious individuals to build wealth through trade, craftsmanship, or business ventures. If you were an enterprising person looking to make your fortune in the medieval world, your opportunities would be dramatically different depending on which continent you found yourself on. In Europe, you might spend your entire life as a peasant farmer with almost no chance of economic advancement. In Asia, you could potentially build a trading empire that spanned continents. As we near the end of our gentle journey through these two medieval worlds, let's pause to consider something that often reveals the deepest truths about any society: how people understood the divine, practiced their faith, and treated those who believed differently. Medieval Europe is often portrayed as deeply religious, and this is certainly true. But the religious landscape was remarkably uniform and, in many ways, restrictive. Christianity, specifically Roman Catholic Christianity, dominated almost every aspect of life. The church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was a political and economic power that controlled education, healthcare, and much of the legal system. Religious diversity was essentially non-existent in medieval Europe. Jews faced periodic persecution and were often forced to live in segregated communities. Muslims were seen as enemies to be fought in crusades. Anyone who questioned Catholic doctrine could be accused of heresy, which was punishable by death. The famous Spanish Inquisition was still to come, but the groundwork for religious intolerance was already well established. The Catholic Church taught that salvation could only be achieved through its specific practices and beliefs. This created a spiritual landscape where questioning, exploration, or alternative approaches to understanding the divine were not just discouraged, but dangerous. European Christianity also had complicated relationships with knowledge and learning. While monasteries preserved some classical texts, the Church was often suspicious of ideas that came from non-Christian sources, or that seemed to challenge religious authority. Scientific inquiry was limited by what was considered compatible with Christian teaching. Now let's float over to medieval Asia, where the spiritual landscape was so diverse and tolerant it might seem almost impossible to someone from medieval Europe. In medieval China, multiple religious and philosophical traditions coexisted peacefully. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism weren't seen as competing religions that demanded exclusive loyalty. Instead, many Chinese people incorporated elements from all three into their spiritual lives. You might visit a Buddhist temple for meditation, consult Taoist principles for understanding nature, and follow Confucian ethics in your social relationships. This religious flexibility extended to practical tolerance. Chinese cities often had Buddhist temples, Taoist shrines, and Confucian academies all within the same neighborhoods. Different religious communities weren't just tolerated, they were seen as contributing to the richness and wisdom of society as a whole. Chinese religious philosophy encouraged questioning and exploration. Buddhist and Taoist traditions included sophisticated practices for examining the nature of reality, consciousness, and human experience. Rather than demanding blind faith, these traditions encourage practitioners to investigate and verify spiritual truth through their own experience. Medieval Japan similarly embraced religious diversity. Shinto, the native Japanese spiritual tradition, coexisted comfortably with imported Buddhism. Many Japanese people participated in both traditions simultaneously, seeing them as addressing different aspects of spiritual life. Shinto connected people with nature and local communities, while Buddhism offered sophisticated approaches to meditation and understanding consciousness. Japanese religious practice was often beautifully integrated with daily life. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry, and martial arts all incorporated spiritual principles without requiring adherence to specific doctrines or beliefs. Spirituality was seen as something that could enhance and beautify ordinary activities rather than something separate from worldly concerns. Medieval India represented perhaps the most religiously diverse society in the medieval world. Hinduism itself encompassed dozens of different traditions, beliefs, and practices. Buddhism was still present in many regions. Jainism offered its own approach to spiritual development. When Islam arrived in India, it often blended with existing traditions rather than completely replacing them. Indian religious philosophy was incredibly sophisticated, with detailed explorations of consciousness, reality, logic, and ethics that were far more advanced than European theological thinking. Indian spiritual traditions encouraged debate, questioning, and multiple approaches to understanding ultimate truth. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval Indian culture developed the concept of religious truth being different for different people, the idea that various paths could lead to the same spiritual destination. This pluralistic approach was completely foreign to medieval European thinking. The contrast in religious art and architecture is striking too. While European religious art was primarily focused on Christian themes and was often restricted by church guidelines, Asian religious art drew from multiple traditions and was encouraged to be creative and innovative. Asian temples, sculptures, and religious texts revealed spiritual understanding that was both deeper and more varied than what was possible in medieval Europe. The treatment of religious minorities provides perhaps the starkest contrast. While medieval Europe saw religious difference as threatening, and often responded with persecution or violence, many medieval Asian societies saw religious diversity as enriching and valuable. Different religious communities often lived side by side, learned from each other, and contributed to shared cultural achievements. If you were a spiritual seeker in the medieval world, your opportunities to explore, question, and develop your understanding would be dramatically different depending on where you lived. In Europe, you would be expected to accept a specific set of beliefs without question. In much of Asia, you might have access to multiple wisdom traditions, sophisticated spiritual practices, and communities that encouraged rather than feared religious exploration. As we prepare to close our gentle exploration of these two fascinating medieval worlds, let's take a moment to step back and ask the big question: why were these differences so dramatic? What created such contrasting experiences for people living at the same time in history? The reasons are complex and interconnected, like a tapestry woven from geography, culture, politics, and pure historical accident. Understanding these causes helps us see how dramatically different human societies can become, even when they're separated by nothing more than distance and time. Geography played a huge role. Europe in the medieval period was still recovering from the collapse of the Roman Empire, which had provided infrastructure, trade networks, and political stability for centuries. When Rome fell, much of that organisational knowledge was lost. Europe fragmented into small competing kingdoms that often fought each other rather than cooperating for mutual benefit. Asia, particularly China, had maintained continuous governmental and cultural institutions for centuries. The Chinese imperial system, whatever its faults, provided stability and continuity that allowed knowledge, technology, and culture to accumulate rather than being lost and rediscovered repeatedly. Trade networks made enormous differences too. Asia was connected by land and sea routes that allowed ideas, technologies, and goods to flow between different cultures. The Silk Road connected China with Central Asia, India, and eventually Europe and Africa. Maritime trade connected India, China, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. These networks meant that innovations developed in one place could quickly spread to others. Europe was more isolated. While some trade existed, particularly through Italian city-states, much of medieval Europe was cut off from the broader currents of global exchange. Ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations that were transforming Asia often took centuries to reach Europe, if they arrived at all. The role of religion was also crucial, but perhaps not in the way you might expect. While European Christianity became increasingly centralized and controlling, many Asian religious traditions encouraged learning, questioning, and intellectual exploration. Buddhism, for example, had from its beginning encouraged adherents to investigate reality for themselves, rather than simply accepting authority. Different attitudes toward government and social organization mattered enormously. Chinese imperial culture, whatever its limitations, valued education, merit-based advancement, and efficient administration. This created societies where learning was rewarded and knowledge was preserved. European feudalism, by contrast, was based on military service and land ownership, which didn't necessarily reward learning or innovation. The preservation and transmission of knowledge followed very different patterns. While European learning was concentrated in monasteries and was primarily focused on religious texts, Asian cultures had developed broader systems for preserving and sharing knowledge. Chinese printing technology, Indian universities, and Japanese court culture all contributed to keeping learning alive and growing. Economic systems also diverged significantly. Asian societies had developed market economies, banking systems, and commercial law that encouraged trade and innovation. European feudalism, while it provided some stability, didn't create the same incentives for economic development or technological advancement. Perhaps most importantly, different cultures developed different attitudes toward change and innovation. Many Asian societies saw new ideas and technologies as potentially beneficial and worth investigating. Medieval European culture was often more concerned with maintaining tradition and avoiding change that might challenge established authority. These differences weren't absolute, and they weren't permanent. European societies would eventually develop their own sophisticated institutions, technologies, and cultural achievements. The Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Age of Exploration would see Europe catch up with and eventually surpass Asia in many areas. But during the medieval period we've been exploring tonight, the contrasts were real and dramatic. A person's opportunities for education, health, economic advancement, religious exploration, and simple quality of life could vary enormously depending on which side of the world they happened to be born on. Understanding these differences doesn't mean judging one culture as better than another. It means appreciating how diverse and creative human societies can be. It means recognizing that the way we live isn't the only way people can live, and that innovations and wisdom can emerge from any culture at any time. The medieval world wasn't a single story of darkness and ignorance punctuated by European awakening. It was a complex tapestry of different societies developing different solutions to the challenges of human life. Some of those solutions were more successful than others, but all of them contributed to the rich heritage of human knowledge and culture that we've inherited today. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself as that time traveller we talked about at the beginning, wandering between these two worlds, marvelling at the diversity of human experience and appreciating the remarkable creativity that people have always brought to the challenge of building meaningful lives in whatever circumstances they found themselves in. The medieval world was vast, diverse, and full of wonders that would surprise us even today. And that's perhaps the most important lesson of all, that human beings have always been capable of creating beauty, knowledge, and meaning, no matter when or where they lived. Sweet dreams, curious travellers, thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through time. Until next time, keep wondering, keep learning, and keep discovering the endless fascinating stories that our shared human history has to tell.